Good evening, everyone. Good evening, everyone, and a very warm welcome to this Meet the Author event with crime writer and honorary St Andrews graduate, Dr. Val McDermid. I'm Professor Jill Plain, and I teach crime fiction here in the School of English. So I'm very much looking forward to talking murder with Val in the Q&A session later. But first, and without further ado, I'll hand over to the principal, Professor Sally Mapstone, for her welcome to you all.
Good evening, everybody. It is always to introduce events in our Meet the Author series through which we spotlight alumni and friends of the university who have published works of note. It is, however, with a distinct sense of occasion that I today introduce Val McDermid, known the world over as the Queen of Tartan Noir, but who is more aptly considered one of Scotland's most successful literary superstars in any genre. To date, Val's novels have sold over 6 million copies and are available in 40 languages, success which speaks to an author of enduring appeal, exceptional craftsmanship, and uncannily in touch with the zeitgeist, nationally, but also globally. Val is a true Fifer, raised in Kirkcaldy, and at 17 she attained a place to read English at St Hilda's College, Oxford, the first ever student at St Hilda's to come from a Scottish state school. Val and I have St Hilda's in common. I was a fellow in English there for over 30 years, and I much value her friendship. I am, of course, also a huge fan of Val's work. Val's crime works come under 4 primary series: the Lindsay Gordon novels, the Kate Brannigan novels, the DCI Karen Pirie series, and the Tony Hill and Carol Jordan series, each of which is equally compelling. I recommend the DCI Karen Pirie novels, and appropriately there's a police car going past. I recommend the DCI Karen Pirie novels in particular to any of you who have not yet engaged with one of Val's works. The Pirie series is a personal favourite of mine, not least because its first novel, The Distant Echo, focuses on a murder in St Andrews in which 4 of our students are implicated. It is essential reading for any St Andrean with a proclivity for crime fiction. Whilst Val is best known for these series, her writing and achievements extend beyond the genre. Val's first major work was a play, Like a Happy Ending, performed at the Plymouth Theatre Company when Val was just 23. And Val was a prominent journalist for many years while she established herself as a crime writer. Val gave up full-time journalism to focus exclusively upon her novels, but she continues frequently to contribute to an array of publications. Last year, Val published My Scotland in partnership with the photographer Alan Macready, a journey through the topography of Scotland with personal reflections by Val and stunning images by Alan. And in March of this year, Val published Imagine a Country, Ideas for a Better Future, with Joe Sharp, Professor of Geography at the University of St Andrews, a book which captures a range of voices from public and literary life in Scotland, all of whom give their views on how our current societal challenges can be overcome through collective and personal action and aspiration. It is a wonderfully affirming and inspirational book. Indeed, there is no end to her talents, and Val is also the lead singer of a band, the Fun-Loving Crime Writers, a name which speaks for itself. It will come as no surprise that they are enormously popular. The Fun-Loving Crime Writers have played internationally, are a regular fixture at literary festivals, and in 2019 they delivered a 50-minute set at Glastonbury. Val, frankly, just goes on doing things, many of the things that most of us would secretly like to do ourselves. It was a great privilege that the university formally could welcome Val into our community and recognise her astounding cultural contributions with an honorary doctorate in 2018. This evening's event is being moderated by Professor Jill Plain from the University School of English. Jill is an internationally respected academic specialising in crime fiction, 20th century popular culture more broadly, gender and sexuality, and the writing of the 2 world wars. Amongst her extensive research publications is the monograph 20th Century Crime Fiction, Gender, Sexuality and the Body, published in 2001 by Edinburgh University Press, which intersects clearly with Val's oeuvre. So tonight we're joined by two authors at the height of their powers and the forefront of their respective fields. In just a moment, I'll hand over to Val, who will speak in particular about her two latest works of fiction, Still Life, the sixth instalment in the DCI Karen Pirie series, published in August, and Christmas is Murder, a collection of festive short stories published last month. After that talk, Professor Plain will moderate a question and answer session. You can submit questions via the Q&A panel. The event will end with a short reading, time permitting, following which Jill will bring proceedings to a close for 6 o'clock. So whether you're tuning in from the dark, noirish streets of St Andrews or some other place across the world, I hope you enjoy this literary encounter. It's a pleasure now to hand over to Val McDermid.
Thank you, Sally. Thank you, Sally, for that effusive welcome. I hope I can live up to it. It seems appropriate that I should be talking about the Karen Pirie novel Still Life, which is the sixth in the series and my latest novel to be published, because it actually starts in the East Neuk of Fife. It opens on a cold, frosty February morning with a lobster boat putting out of St Monans and making an unfortunate catch. But also the roots of that series is in St Andrews. The first novel to feature Karen Pirie, The Distant Echo, does begin here, again on a frosty, snowy night when 4 students are walking home and come upon a dying woman in the snow. The suspicion that hangs over them is a shadow over the next 25 years of their life. And then the case suddenly reawakens with terrible consequences for many of the people involved. I wanted to write a book. I had the idea for the book because, as these things often happens in a small way. A friend told an anecdote over dinner about her son, who was a medical student. He was coming home from the pub one night with 3 of his friends. They'd had a few drinks, and they came upon a group of youths beating up a young man who was lying on the ground. And being nice guys, they chased away the assailants and then went back to check on the guy on the ground because he had been bleeding quite heavily. And that was when the police arrived. So you've got these young lads, drunk, blood on their hands, leaning over a guy who's on the ground in a pretty bad way. And of course, the police assume that these are the assailants. Now, luckily, the guy on the ground was conscious enough to say, these are not the guys who beat me up. These are the Good Samaritans. And the whole matter was resolved fairly quickly. But because I have a nasty, devious, twisted mind, I immediately sprang to, but what if he'd been unconscious? What if he'd been dead? And so there began the idea for 4 students coming upon someone in the snow on the point of death. And I thought, where can I set this? And of course, having grown up in Fife, I knew St Andrews well as a regular visitor. It was often a place we'd stop off on our Sunday run-outs when I was young. We'd stop for an ice cream or a fish supper on our way home. And so I thought, I know this university, I've had friends who went there. It's a small enough town for the town and the university to intersect, for there to be crossovers between students and the people who live there year round. And I thought, it's also a place that I know and I can write about it with a degree of authenticity. And that's really why it was set in St Andrews in the first instance. And then, of course, when I started researching this, one of the ways I research historical settings, and this was set at the time I was writing in 2003, it was set partly 25 years before in 1978. So I wanted to look at newspapers of 1978 to have a sense of what was happening in the town, what was happening in the wider world, and useful things like what was on at the pictures, how much was a can of lager, the kind of things you need in the back of your head to flesh out what you're writing. And I went to the offices of the St Andrews Citizen to get some information from the back numbers, and the receptionist there asked me what I was doing and why I needed this, and I explained I was writing a crime novel. And she said, "Oh, you're going to find the body on the Pictish cemetery at Hallow Hill." And I had never known about the Pictish cemetery at Hallow Hill, but I immediately made myself acquainted with it. And I walked up the hill and I saw these little stone markers of where the graves were, and I thought, this is the perfect place for a murder. So that's the kind of serendipity that comes together with the seed of an idea, and somewhere in my brain, they start to make the shape of a story. And that's how started my engagement with Karen Pirie and the Cold Case Unit, first in Fife and now in Edinburgh, and again brought me back to the East Neuk for Still Life. Now, I was planning Still Life, I was thinking about it last summer, summer 2019 and into the autumn, because I tend to spend a bit of time with a book in my head before it's ready to be written. I was in New Zealand for 2.5 months at the time as a visiting professor at the University of Otago in Dunedin, which likes to think of itself as the Edinburgh of the South. It's quite confusing, really, because they had the same street names but in a different alignment. So you think you're going to turn into Princes Street, but you find yourself turning into George Street instead. But that apart, it was a nice place to be, to think and to work and to go for walks. And I was thinking about this book that was going to be about identity, and it was going to be about art. And the reason it was going to be about art was I found myself increasingly thinking about images, about the way that artists see us when they paint a portrait. Partly I had been watching the Sky Arts programme, Portrait Artist of the Week, which I found absolutely fascinating, where artists, professional and amateur, have 3 subjects and 4 hours to create a portrait. But also because I'd been involved in a project myself. I had an artist friend called Audrey Grant, who had come up with the idea for a project called The Long Look. And essentially, I went to her studio every couple of weeks over a period of about 2 years, and I sat for her for 2 hours. And every week she began the same charcoal drawing. Essentially, she'd rub out parts of it, she'd add to it, she'd subtract to it. At the end of every session, what was facing me was a different image of myself. And every week the image would be photographed. And at the end of these 2 years, there were only 2 drawings. And it was fascinating to me how the drawing changed depending on where I was in a book. That might sound slightly odd, but when I was at the start of a book, I'm always in a very sort of vague, slow, feeling my way into a book kind of phase. And those drawings were quite indistinct, blurred almost in places. And then by the time you get to the end of a book, I'm firing on all 4 cylinders, and it's all I can think about. It's in my head. It's there when I go to sleep. It's there when I wake up. No one can have a sensible conversation with me in the month before deadline. And those drawings were quite different. They were almost electric. There was as if there were sparks coming off me. And I thought that was extraordinary, that an artist just looking at me could somehow see a difference in what was going on inside my head. So these ideas about portraiture were also tying into my ideas about identity. How would we identify? How do we identify ourselves? What are the ways in which we say, yes, this is me, or yes, this is him? And so those ideas were rumbling around in my head. And I thought, as I thought about it, I thought I want to start the book in Fife. I want to start it off the East Neuk. And I want it to be in the dead of winter. I don't particularly know why. It seemed quite important to me that this was going to be a wintry book. It's going to be cold. And those wonderful blue skies that we get in Fife in the winter, when it's really clear and really crisp, and there's a particular shade of blue that sets off against the sea, and it's really quite magical. So that was in my head as this is going to be the setting, this is what it's going to be like. And at that point, there was no cloud on the horizon, really, other than Brexit, which I knew I would have to make reference to, because I also knew quite early on that this book was going to involve Karen Pirie and her cold case team moving outside the jurisdiction of Scotland into other jurisdictions. So I thought there would be moments where she would have to reflect that post-Brexit this was going to be much more complex, and there might be issues with things like the European arrest warrants. And so those things were all rolling through my head at the time. And then as I started writing the book in January, as I usually do, and as we moved into February, it was quite clear that there was now a cloud on the horizon. And I was kind of taking cognizance of this with my non-writer's head. I was just looking at this as a human being, as a person, thinking, wonder how this is going to be. Is this going to be the one? Because about 3 years ago, I did a series of radio dramas for Radio 4, which was a project that I did with the Wellcome Trust. Every year they invite a group of writers, a group of radio producers, and a group of scientists to come together and spend a couple of days talking about a particular theme, a particular topic. And the year I was invited, the topic was antimicrobial resistance. And I listened to the then Chief Medical Officer, Sally Davis, talking about the consequences of antimicrobial resistance. And she was essentially saying there's a plague coming and we're probably all going to die. And I found this, I thought the only kind of play that I can write from this, the only thing I can write from this is an apocalypse. And so I wrote a 3-part radio drama called Resistance, which was about a terrible bug, a bacterium coming that that antibiotics couldn't stop in its tracks. And I gave this bug the perfect combination of infectivity and lethality. And so it became a global plague, a global pandemic. And so I was thinking about that as I was writing away on still life throughout February, thinking, is this going to be the one? Is this the one that's going to take us all off? And also because that had been in my mind, because we're in the process of turning that into a graphic novel, which will be coming out next year at some point. And so I'm writing away, and there's things going on the outside world, and you're kind of half conscious of them when you're writing, but not in a sort of big, meaningful way. But then came lockdown, and it was quite clear to me that this book, set in February 2020, could not ignore the fact of what was on the horizon. And so I started thinking about how I was going to deal with that. I didn't want to write a COVID novel, as it were. I didn't want to write a plague novel, but I wanted to make some oblique references to what was going on, or what we understood to be going on during the month of February. So there are a couple of references in the book to this thing that's happening, so we're off stage. But of course, as I'm writing about this happening off stage, I'm very much living in it on stage. And this was a very strange experience, writing in lockdown. I found myself, I was still able to write, but I was less productive than I would normally be. It took me longer to write the same number of words in a day as I would normally write. And that was partly because I kept switching off and looking at the news and looking at Twitter, looking at Facebook, looking at what was happening in the world, what the latest news was. I mean, it seems so long ago now, but I imagine many of you were the same at the time. We were just hungry to know what was happening, because this was beyond our ken. We'd never lived through anything like this. And there was always that spectre of anxiety hanging over us. Is this going to affect us? Is this going to affect the people I love? I actually had a mild, what's called the mild form of COVID quite early on. And there was a couple of weeks in March that I completely lost. I really remember almost nothing of what I was doing then, or what happened then. And checking back through the files of the chapters of this book, I see there was a period of about 17 days where I wrote almost nothing. And I don't know what else I was doing. I mean, I wasn't having fun, that's for sure. So, as I say, I've gone on through the last 9 months in different ways. I finished the book, and I edited the book, and what did I do? What was I going to do now? My year normally has a fairly rigid pattern. I write in the first chunk of the year, the first 3-4 months I'm writing, then there's a bit of time editing, and then the summer is a series of festivals and events. Some of them with the band that Sally was telling you about, the Fun-Loving Crime Writers. We go off and do events at book festivals and have a great time. And we have that camaraderie and comradeship that happens when you make music together and enjoy it. But there's just the whole thing of festivals and writers' festivals, which moved online. They became virtual. And we did our best to render events that were as close to being in the room as it were as it's possible. But of course, there's limitations to what you can do, as you're experiencing tonight. If we were all together in the room, it would be a very different feeling. There would be a camaraderie, I suppose, that doesn't happen when you're doing this sort of event virtually. I would hopefully be getting a response from the audience. People might be laughing in the right places, or gasping in the right places, or just muttering sort of softly to themselves, moving in their seats, making me feel that they were engaged with me and feeding back. But that was gone. We're doing events online, and it's just, you know, me in my living room, and sometimes in my shorts and my baffies. You can only see me from the waist up. So I was doing that, but what I was missing, and what I took me a long time to understand the detail of what I was missing. What I was missing was the conversation of my colleagues, just being with other people who engage in creative activity, writers, artists, musicians, theatre people. I wasn't seeing them, wasn't having those daft conversations that you have at festivals when you bump into a poet you've not seen for 3 years and you sit down and you have a glass of wine and a catch up. It's not necessarily conversations about technical stuff like how are you on the Oxford comma these days? But it's more just that sort of general conversation you have with colleagues, I suppose the water cooler conversations you'd have in the office that writers have at festivals. And I realised eventually that I was really suffering from not having those conversations with friends who were in some way or another in the creative business, in the business of talking about books, or paintings, whatever. And so I have come to understand that I need to refresh myself in this way. So what I've taken to doing lately has been hooking up with friends who live locally and going for walks, which we're allowed to do. And so I've been doing having these conversations as we walk through parks, as we walk through woodland, as we walk by the river, as we walk through cemeteries. Cemeteries are great for conversations. And that has been something that I think has really brought me back to my creative self, if you like. Of course, one of the other problems I faced was what to write. My novels as a sequence, whether they're in a series or standalones or whatever, have all been very firmly anchored in the here and now. They have a sense of place, but they also have a sense of time. Not, I hope, in a way that ages them, but just in a way that ties them in to our experience of history, to our experience of our lives. I couldn't write against this plague. I couldn't write against COVID because I had no solid ground to stand on. The ground was shifting sand under my feet. Every day brought something new. Every day things shifted. The conditions under which we were living were constantly changing. And I found it impossible to think about writing a novel that's set right now, right here. And there will be novels set against the pandemic. There will be novels that are being written now about what we've gone through. There will be novels that are rooted in our experience of that. I'm not sure how much we'll want to read them. I'm not sure how interesting they will be to us when we get beyond this. I suspect that in the 1920s, there were a lot of novels written about the Spanish flu that have not survived because either they weren't very good or they weren't very interesting. And I wonder whether the same thing will happen to us now. But that still didn't solve my dilemma of what can I write? How can I write something? And so I looked at an idea that I've been had for a while, and I'd been tinkering around with and not really doing anything about. And I had this idea of a quintet of novels featuring the same protagonist over a period of time. So I thought I could do these novels set in 79, 89, 99, 2009, and 2019. All of them really interesting times. 1979, the Winter of Discontent, the arrival of Margaret Thatcher. 1989, the fall of the Berlin Wall. 1999, the turn of the millennium, and so on. And that sort of gave me breathing space before I have to deal with the contemporary again. I think somewhere in the middle of all that, there will be the next Karen Pirie novel once we have a clearer sense of where we are and what life is going to be like when we get through this and get onto the vaccine and get back to a different normal. But until that happens, I'm going to lose myself in history and bury myself back in the newspaper archives. Excuse me. The other, sorry. See, I talk too much and then I get a dry throat. Meanwhile, my publisher said, how would you feel about a short story anthology? And I said, I'd be very happy about a short story anthology. I don't write many short stories. The idea for a short story comes to me seldom. And very often when I have the idea for a short story, it ends up, I think, that would be a really good subplot. And so I kind of take it off and use it somewhere else for something else. But over the years, I write the odd short story. Usually someone commissions me to write it for an anthology or for a particular occasion, like, you know, they ask for a Christmas short story. And to be honest, I struggle because short stories don't come to me readily. Some writers seem to have a tremendous fluency for writing short stories and do it very well. but I am not one of those. I write them seldom, and when I do, they're a bit of a struggle. But when we looked at the one, I had one previous short story collection, Stranded, which was published some years ago now, and I looked at the stories I had written since that collection came out, and we realised that quite a few of them had quite dark, wintry themes to them. So it seemed like a good idea to do something for Christmas. And my publishers, Little Brown, made this beautiful book. I can't get over how lovely this is. I mean, it is quite frankly the prettiest book I have ever published. It's just lovely. Wonderful cover art by Angela Harding, and you know, it's sort of the sort of book that frankly cries out to be bought and given. And that's the advert over. So we came up with a bunch of stories that fitted the broad theme. And there was one other story that I'd had kicking around in the back of my head for some time, which was a short story involving Sherlock Holmes. And so I buckled down and spent a week writing Holmes for Christmas, which is a terrible, terrible pun. And the story kind of gets going on Christmas Eve, 1913. So, as I say, it's a collection of short stories. They're not linked in any way, except that they're all about murder. And I like to think of this as being a sort of companion piece, I suppose, to the Norwegian Easter tradition. At the end of the winter in Norway, people open up their cabins where they spend time in the spring and the summer and the early autumn. And they go off to their cabins with their family. So after a long, hard winter, off they go, and the entire family is sort of squeezed into these small cabins and forced into each other's company, usually without any other form of entertainment. And interestingly enough, this is the month when the Norwegians publish all the crime and thrillers. So people go off to their cabins with armfuls of crime novels and thrillers. And I've always thought that this is a preventative measure. It's a form of sublimation. If you're reading about murder, then you're probably not going to murder that irritating uncle who's always got on your nerves by day 3, or stab that small child who is so irritating on a continual basis. So if you go away and read about crime, you feel relaxed. You feel the urge to commit the crime slip away from you. Well, that's the general theory anyway. And I know for many of us, although it's lovely to see the family and the friends over Christmas time, and who knows what we'll all be able to do this Christmas with that slight relaxation of the rules that will allow us to go and visit friends in distant parts, even though the virus doesn't actually know it's on holiday. But who knows how people are going to feel in these strange times. And I hope that perhaps reading the stories in this book will be a kind of preventative, a kind of sedative against the murderous urges that may spill over at this time of year. I'm certainly not the first person to have written about crime at Christmas, and I'm sure I won't be the last. So that really is pretty much what I've got to say for now, and I think we're going to talk a little more about the beautiful thing that is Christmas's murder, and the almost as beautiful thing that is still life. And Jill, I know, has a raft of interesting questions to put to me. So I think it's time for me to stop lecturing you all and let Jill ask some questions so that you've got a bit of a voice in this as well.
A brilliant start. You can tell that a semester of online teaching has done some damage to my my technical resources. What I was trying to say was that I've just had a delightful weekend when I should have been doing my marking, but instead I spent it reading Christmas is Murder. Another glimpse at that time, and still life. And I cannot recommend them highly enough. So I do indeed have a raft of questions, some of my own and some that have been sent in advance of this conversation. But just before we get into them, I see that we've had a nice question from Nancy Muirhead, who has picked up on something else Val's been doing during lockdown, which is your cooking the books season. Has that been fun? And are you going to publish a cookbook? Asks Nancy.
Well, we started doing the Cooking the Book. We started doing the Cooking the Books videos because I was getting slightly concerned at the number of things I was having to do online because of festivals and things. And I thought people are going to get fed up of me just sitting and talking. And I'd like to do something that's a little bit different, that engages with my readers and a wider audience, I suppose, without just being me sitting and talking endlessly about myself. And one or two people in the past have commented that food features in the books, and there are a couple of times when characters cook a meal or they go for a meal, and because in my world people talk to each other over their food. You know, they go for a meal out, they go to the pub and have a pub lunch or something, but eating food is an occasion when conversations happen, and that's sometimes when the evidence is drawn out from someone you're interviewing. So there's quite a lot of references in the books, and my partner, Joe Sharp, who is a professor at St Andrews, has become a very accomplished videographer during lockdown. And we thought it would be fun to do a couple of videos of some of the recipes in the books. So we started doing Cooking the Books, recipes from the fiction kitchen, which have developed a kind of comedy double act in between the cooking. And people have said how much they've enjoyed them, and people have cooked the things that we have put up online, ranging from Hamish's hipster porridge to Halloween special that we did of treacle scones. I have to say, Hamish's hipster porridge has become quite a talking point. I have one of my friends, Lynn Anderson, the crime writer, is involved with the organisation of the National Porridge Championships up in Carbridge, and she tells me that I would be drummed out of town if I turned up with a bowl of Hamish's hipster porridge with its blueberries and its buckwheat and its assorted nut butters and seeds. Anyway, this has been fun to do, and we've just recorded the Christmas special, which will be online probably this weekend or the beginning of next week. We did a little trailer for it, which you can find on YouTube. On our Cooking the Books Fiction Kitchen site. If you just go to YouTube and put Cooking the Books Val McDermid, up comes the whole list of all of them. We ended up making 8 of them, and then we did the Halloween special. And as I say, we're doing a Christmas special, and I think we're going to do a New Year special. And then I think we're going to give it a wee break for a while because, well, I'm running out of things to do for recipes. But also, I don't want it to start being a sort of like, you know, a thing, a chore. So we're going to quit while we're ahead and while we're still having fun. I do recommend this Christmas special, though. It's you'll see us doing things we've never done before. And it turned out surprisingly tasty, actually. But I'll say no more than that. I'm not giving away too many clues. We're not going to do a cookbook because the thing with cookbooks is you have to have precise measurements and proper recipes and things like that I'm not very good at. It's more like there's a handful of this and I'll put another handful of that and or a wee pinch of that because that doesn't look like enough. So I'm not going to be the Nigella of the crime fiction world.
Lovely, thanks, Val. It would be nice now, certainly fun for me, to talk a little bit more about what you've been up to in still life. Because it's a typically densely plotted and complicated narrative. And I was very struck when I was reading the short stories. In one of them, The Long Black Veil, you have your narrator observe that it's very easy to point to where things end, but it's a lot harder to be sure where they start. And that kind of struck me almost as something as I could set on an exam paper for my crime fiction students, you know, explain the significance of this for the understanding of crime narrative. So it does, I think, sum something up about the process. Does it capture your writing or plotting process?
To a degree, as I said earlier, the books usually start with quite a small thing. It's an anecdote someone tells me. It's a throwaway line I hear on the radio. It's something that I read in a feature or a science magazine or something, or it's small, and it's something that makes me go, oh, that's really interesting, or I didn't know that. You know, for example, a few years ago, I wrote a book called The Grave Tattoo, which is a present-day thriller, but it's rooted in the events of 200 years before, and it was triggered by someone at a crime writing event who was giving a talk, just saying in passing, William Wordsworth and Fletcher Christian were at school together, and I was like, I didn't know that. And later on in the same talk, he said, and there was a strong and persistent rumour that Fletcher Christian didn't die on Pitcairn, but came back to the Lake District. And immediately that set the wheels turning for me. And I'm thinking, what if this? What if this? What if this? What if he'd come back? What if he'd told his story to Wordsworth? What if there was an undiscovered manuscript? And that got me excited and got the juices flowing. So it's those sort of things that start me off. But very quickly, I figure out, I suppose, who's got to die, which is one kind of ending. And then I have to work, then I usually know by that stage who did what to whom and what the ending of the story is. But when I start, these days, I used to plan very carefully when I first started, because I worried that my plotting was not my strength. And so I spent a lot of time working out the story step by step, and I'd have my little file cards with each scene and each chapter. And when I was writing something like the Kate Brannigan novels that had 3 or 4 different storylines going on, I'd have them on different colours of file cards. So I'd make this sort of one from the pink pile and 2 from the yellow pile, Carol, you know, until it made what seemed like narrative sense. But even that early, I kind of knew what ending I was aiming at. Now I write much more loosely, much more flexibly. I've heard the American writer E.L. Doctorow describe it as driving at night writing. You know what your destination is, and you know where you're starting from, but all you can see is the bit of road and the headlights in front of you, and you have to fare forward, trusting that you will end up where you intended to be, or as close as makes no difference. So that's when I start. That's kind of what I know. I know what the ending is going to be, pretty much, and I know maybe 2 or 3 key elements along the way, key turning points that I have to get to before I can move into the next phase of the story. And it's quite frightening at times and quite unnerving when I'm not quite sure how I'm going to get to that next turning point. And sometimes I don't know exactly where it's going to end. There's one book I wrote a few years ago called The Vanishing Point, which again a standalone. And right when I started the book, I knew where the final scene was going to take place. I knew the room, I knew who was going to be in the room, but I just wasn't sure who was going to walk out of the room alive. And as I got through the book, it became quite clear to me by about 3/4 of the way through, there was only one inevitable ending to this book. And so that was fine from that point on. I kind of motored towards the end, knowing exactly where I was heading for.
Thanks, that's grand. And it's really, I mean, there's a really important dynamic in crime writing between plot and character. If you don't have a decent detective figure, if you don't have compelling characters involved, then you can have the best plot in the world and it's not going to be as much fun. And then there's this third dimension, your setting, and the sheer amount of research that goes into these novels. Because you were talking earlier tonight about the portraits that sort of got you hooked to this idea of portraiture. And that obviously plays a very important role in still life. And I wonder if you could say a little bit more about that, because in this case, you don't just have some portraits or some portrait artists, you create a plausible young British artist figure and you insert him into this landscape of the real art world with a bit of real politics in the background. And I wondered about both setting your story alongside real events and people, and this imagination process that gives you a new artist.
Yeah. I was conscious when I was creating a successful young British artist that I did not want it to be perceived as in any way a portrait of an existing artist. I think it's I didn't want people to be going like, oh, that's Damien Hirst, or oh, that's Tracy Emin, or oh, it's Grayson Perry. I wanted it to be someone who had a very specific identity of their own. And so I thought about this and thought about what to do, and I came up with this slightly mad idea that the portraiture technique that I developed for the book is the idea that the artist would paint a picture of a landscape or a building or a specific place that was relevant to the subject of the portrait. And they would so paint the landscape, then cut up the landscape into pieces and basically make the portrait out of a collage of the pieces from the landscape. And I've explained this to a few artist friends of mine, and at least one of them has sat there going, yes, I could see how that might be really, just let me go and look at the collage in my studio. So I think that the secret of inserting people into real worlds, like politics, like art, like business or whatever, P.T. James did this all the time. I think all of her novels are set in the world of work. So they've been like a barrister's chambers or a publishing house. The secret is, it's the same as the secret that you have with writing about place. You have to know it well enough to understand where you can place a fictitious object, whether that's a person or a nightclub or something, that makes sense in the context of that wider world. So you have to find a way to make them real within that world, but you also have to know the world well enough, to understand it well enough that things are not misplaced. You know, I often said, you know, like if you're writing about a nightclub where drugs are being dealt, you'd be pretty stupid to give it the name of a real nightclub, because, you know, big men with baseball bats would come knocking on your door. But equally, you'd have to know your city well enough not to put it down in the middle of a leafy suburb. So it's the same kind of thing that applies to creating people within their worlds. And that really involves, I guess, talking to people and listening and looking. I'm always slightly wary talking about research, because I'm always deeply invested in the research for a book when I'm actually writing it. And, you know, for 3 minutes, I am the world's leading expert on antimicrobial resistance. And 3 weeks later, I've forgotten 90% of what I learned. So a lot of it is, for me, it's like, you know, that sort of deep diving and mining what I need, discarding what I don't need. There's always a huge spoil heap of unused research with all my books. And then I write the book, and then off by the time it's published, people start asking me questions. I'm thinking, I knew that, I didn't know that, and I just blag my way through it. You know, really, I am as much of a con artist as anybody I write about in my books.
That's a lovely image. And the other sort of component factor, you have these specific scenarios in each book, but you also have continuity, the crucial continuity of your detective character. And you've been putting Karen through quite a lot, quite a significant and painful journey. And grief is something that has been very much a theme, a preoccupation in the books. And in this particular one, we have both Karen dealing with her ongoing re-entry into life, reanimation, and at the same time we have, because it's a novel about identity theft as well, we have a situation. I don't want to give too much plot away in asking this question, so I'm a moment while I try and phrase myself. We have a woman whose husband has disappeared, and I think that happens fairly early on, so I can say that without. And she, but we don't get much. You don't take us very close to her, not like you do in some of the Carol Jordan and Tony Hill novels, where you take us very intimately into the mind of killers and of their victims. This novel, you know, what are the choices you make between when you want to give your readers, you know, proximity to troubled minds, and when you want to keep them at a distance and guessing, so we don't know whether this woman is involved or what she knows? What are those kind of proximity distance questions?
I think they generally arise from the story as it evolves. The thing about the crime novel, I suppose, that's one of the differences between the crime novel and the literary novel, is with the crime novel, you always have to be conscious of what you hold back. You have to be candid with the reader up to a certain point, and you have to give the appearance of candor, while sometimes having to hold things back, because otherwise the tension in the plot slackens, and that balance between character and plot becomes an imbalance. And the engine that drives the story forward, I always think, is a kind of symbiotic biofeedback between plot and character. Plot feeds character, plot feeds character. What you do with the plot then implies things you can and can't do with the character, and vice versa. So there are times when it's important not to bring the reader too close to the character, because you're then going to have to lie to the reader. And there's nothing annoys me more as a reader than finding that the author has lied to me in that very specific way, that they've told me a lie about what somebody's going through. And the other thing I thought in this particular instance was that the woman whose husband went missing. It's not a big secret. It's known very early on. He went missing a long time ago, 10 years ago. And part of any issue for her is that she's in a way being kind of frozen in time, because there's so many ways in which she can't move forward, because what happened to her husband is not known. And so there are all sorts of difficulties about living her life, just simple things like paying the bills, getting through the day-to-day. And so I think that in order for her to have got through those years, she has had to put a distance between herself and what's happened, in a way, almost. The immediacy of her loss has had to be put to one side, because she doesn't know what the outcome is going to be. She still doesn't know what happened to her husband. She may believe he's dead, but there's always got to be some part of her that believes he's still alive, because she can't know. And to live your life in that heightened state all those years would be impossible. You would collapse under the weight of it. And so the distance I put between the reader and her, I think, is the distance that she has put between herself and the world, in a way.
Mm. That's beautifully put. And I've got two final questions about the development of the Karen Pirie thrillers. Because another recurring character, or a background character, is of course Merrick Shand, the man who killed Phil, and he is getting out of prison as this novel starts, and you leave quite open his role in this novel and in future novels, and this brings up, I think, as it directly brings up in the novel, the nature of criminal acts and the possibility of rehabilitation. And I wondered, this is my first question, whether this is a debate that particularly interests you or motivates your writing. And my other question is quite simple. You've also introduced a new police character in Daisy, who, interesting change of dynamic, and yeah, I'd be curious to know whether you think she has a future in the series.
Well, on the first question, I suppose my interest in the nature of redemption and rehabilitation goes back quite a long way, and it's one that I've explored, I think, quite extensively in the Tony Hill and Carol Jordan novels. I don't subscribe to the view that I know some of my fellow crime writers do, that evil is a thing, that some people are just born bad, or some people write about evil as if it's something you catch on a cold day if you go out without a vest. But I don't believe, I think people do horrible, awful things to each other, but I don't think people are just born bad. I think if you subscribe to the view that people are just born bad and they come out of the womb readily baked evil, then it lets all the rest of us off the hook. Because why would you try to make society any better? Why would you try to make people's prospects in life any better if it's just going to have the same outcome, if they're just going to be bad anyway? Really, there's no point. And I don't want to live my life in that sort of hopeless chasm of misery and consigning people to just, your lives are going to be awful and that's just tough. Because it shouldn't have to be like that. And so I've always felt very strongly that the urges towards retribution are not the positive urges within our society, and that working with people in prison and working with people before it comes to that is a really important thing to do. And a lot of the research that's being done now indicates that you can make significant changes to people's life chances if you have early interventions. And some of these early interventions are quite straightforward and quite simple. One of them is the relationship of the parent reading to the child. There's been research done and active programs done with prisoners, young men in prison, who become fathers and don't know how to be fathers because their own father was violent or abusive and drunk or just wasn't there. Absent fathers, abusive fathers, they don't know what you have to do to be a father. And one of the things that they're working with them in prison is getting them to read to their children. Reading a bedtime story to your child over the phone, even if you're still in prison, is a really important thing. And a lot of these young men have very poor literacy skills, and so they teach them the story that they're going to read to the child. And these relationship bonds are demonstrably changing people's lives. When they come out of prison, they have a much different relationship with the people around them. These are the kind of things that small changes can make big differences. And that was one of the things that we discovered with when we put Imagine a Country together. Many of the things that people suggested as things they would like to see in a country they would like to live in were quite small things in and of themselves, but you could see right away how they would transform lives. So I believe these things are possible. One of the people I most admire in this field is a woman called Gwen Adshead, who's a psychiatrist who was the leading psychotherapist at Broadmoor for many years. And I remember her saying, very vividly saying to me, our people come to us as victims of a disaster, but they are the disaster in their own lives. And it's not a pointless activity to try and make things better. So at the heart of, I suppose, much of what I write is the notion that there are ways to perhaps mitigate what people have done, and that people can, in some way, redeem some of the terrible things that they have done. And the other part of your question is Daisy, who arrives as a new member of the team, it's one of the, often things happen in the course of books that you never really planned, and then they take on a life of their own almost. Because you see the potential once you've put them in place. It's not that they mysteriously come alive and tell you what to do, but you've created a potential for them and you can see how they fill that. And I basically gave this Karen, this new member of the team, Daisy is seconded from the major incident team in Fife to Karen's cold cases team. And really, initially Daisy was a plot device, because I knew I needed more bodies than just Karen and her sidekick, her wingman, Jason. And so I seconded someone. And then the more I wrote Daisy, the more I thought she has potential. She's definitely a character who could create a different dynamic within the team. Yeah, Daisy will be back.
Glad to hear it. Her appetite alone will keep you in pages of text. I've actually now got, I think, what is an impossible question for you from one of the many that were sent in by people. And this is from Donald Ramsey, who's taking the evening degree here at St Andrews, and he asks which contemporary crime writers will be remembered in 100 years' time? Who do you think are going to be the keepers out there?
Well, that's a really difficult question. I mean, of course, I will say I expect my books to survive and to be widely read and appreciated 100 years from now, but that would be a ridiculous expectation, really. It's readers who make that distinction, ultimately. I think it's very difficult to make a judgment call on this. I suppose if I was thinking about it, I would look at the writers who were around from about 100 years ago that still have a prominent place in the canon now, that are not just read by people like us who are sort of experts in the genre and interested in the history of the genre. And so you've obviously got Conan Doyle with Sherlock Holmes, who is this iconic figure with a status beyond the books. And indeed, I I do wonder how many people actually read the Sherlock Holmes stories and books, but are more familiar with the movies and the TV series, there's various iterations. And you also have Agatha Christie, who is one of the four queens of crime. And Christie, to a lesser extent, Sayers, Allingham and Marsh have persisted to this day. And I suppose, what do they have in common? Well, the first obvious thing they have in common is memorable characters, and characters that have spawned a sort of slew of novels, if you like. Christie with Poirot and Miss Marple, Sherlock Holmes, obviously, Dorothy Sayers with Lord Peter Wimsey, Allingham with Albert Campion, Niall Marsh with Elaine. But there's an awful lot of books that outsold those books at the time they were published. There were huge bestsellers in the 1920s that just haven't survived. If you were to say the name Sidney Horler to the average reader of crime fiction, that you get a blank look. Horler was hugely popular in the 1920s. He sold books by the barrow load. He was the Geoffrey Archer of his time, if you like, and his books have not survived. Mostly because they're sadistically violent, they're homophobic, they're misogynist, they're racist, they're anti-Semitic. All those kind of things that really have not helped them to find an audience, and they're also really badly written, has to be said. I suppose what will survive are the game changers, the books and the writers that have spawned a whole subset of imitators or followers. So in that sense, Sherlock Holmes, the first consulting detective, you've got Christie's originality with plotting, the disturbing moral landscape of Patricia Highsmith, who really was only coming to her own in the last 20 or 30 years. She was less appreciated in her time than she is now. You've got Raymond Chandler sort of transplanting the medieval knight and his quest into between the wars Los Angeles, and then you've got obviously William McIlvanney writing crime fiction with a very much a working class perspective and a very Scottish perspective, but the combination of the location and the class opened so many doors to so many writers like me. Without McIlvanney as a carrier of the standard, I don't know how easy Ian Rankin and I would have found it to shoulder the door open. And you got P.D. James again, who I mentioned earlier, had an anatomization of the world of work, and Middle England will probably survive because she has a very precise sense of that time and that place and that milieu. And I suppose also you got a writer like Thomas Harris, whose Hannibal Lecter novels created the whole sort of subgenre excuse me, of the profiler and the psychopathic serial killer. Excuse me.
I think the sound of Val coughing there is a sign that we have wrung our absolute value for money out of your contribution tonight. You're such an eloquent commentator on the genre and the process of writing. You don't just write good books, you talk an excellent game. So thank you so much, Val, for that wonderful session as a masterclass in thinking about crime fiction. And thank you too, as we're coming to an end here, it is my pleasure to thank everybody involved in putting this Meet the Author event together, particularly colleagues in the development office and the IT team who have kept my microphone muted and unmuted appropriately. And my thanks, of course, to Professor Sally Mapstone for spearheading the event and the initiative. And thank you, everyone who has tuned in to listen from your atomized spaces around St Andrews and the world. Thank you very much for joining us, and good night.